It is very interesting fact that when you listen to music and then you listen to it again, you don't get bored by it. In fact, it's the repetition that gives you pleasure. And I think that that's a very deep property of the way the brain works. Repetition has been highly underrated as a component in art, and that it clearly enhanced one's artistic experience, and it needed to be studied. Well, that's all I needed. I suddenly elevated repetition to center stage, and I started looking at it, and I suddenly realized, I'll be darned. End rhyme in poetry, the construction of a melody, and famous paintings by people like Andy Warhol and Gustav Caillebotte, a great impressionist artist, and photographs. One by Gillier, that he took this photograph of girls in the window, which is probably made more money than any other photograph in history. I think the photograph has now earned north of $12 million. Wow. And I showed that that particular photograph is identical to Andy Warhol's Campbell soup cans. And I showed that that was identical to what Duke Ellington was doing in Satin Doll. And I showed that that was identical to what William Wordsworth was doing in his any rhyming poetry poem. And then I found it in the Homeric epics. I found it in Anglo-Saxon poetry, Beowulf, and I actually found that in what I now realize is an art form that exists that nobody really realized was an art form. When I read an essay by Italo Calvino, the great Italian novelist and critic, about collectors, people who collect, and that collections are really a form of art, where repetition is what's exactly at play in the repetition. Each object in the collection is just like the other one, except it's a little bit different. And that's just like end rhyme in poetry. So ham and spam are just like one another, except they're a little bit different. And if you listen to the first two bars of Satin Doll, ba boo da boo da, ba doo da, and then you listen to the next two bars, ba boo da boo da, ba doo ba, they're exactly the same rhythmically. You'll know that as a drummer, but they are slightly different. The second two bars are one step up from the first two bars. And that trick permeates the whole tune. So, for example, the bridge, ba 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 doo ba da, ba 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 doo ba da, ba 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 doo ba da, ba 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 doo ba da, ba. Same thing, identical rhythm, up one half step for the second four bars. And that's true of Ain't She Sweet? That's true of Funny Valentine. That's true of, I mean, I'm contemplating doing another study. I'm going to take Dick Hyman's did a book called 100 Jazz Standards, and I'm contemplating going and analyzing every one of the melodies. First of all, I bet every one of those shows rhyme in the meter. I mean, in the melody. It's just, and now you might say, what? Why? What's behind all this? Answer is this: people get aesthetic pleasure from rhyme. And that's what Elizabeth Margulis showed. But she didn't, she only showed it in music, but it's all over the place. I talk about it in my first book, uh, uh, The Mental Life of Modernism. There's a great 14th century composer by the name of Guillaume de Machaut. And he did a piece of music called La fin est dans mon commencement, which translated means my end is my beginning. And what he did was he built a choral piece of 20 bars. And at the end of the 20th bar, the next 20 bars are the first 20 bars backwards. It's absolutely gorgeous piece of choral music. It's, I think they call it a rondo. But in any case, it's really remarkable because it's very hard to construct. It comes out beautifully, and yet there's no way that anybody knows what's going on consciously, because nobody can take each 20 bars and hold them in their heads and then analyze them. But I think that's one of the earliest, and I suspect that it goes back way before that. That's just, I'm really a chapter out of my biography that I can't go back beyond 14th century. Once I started looking, you see, the point is, when you do any kind of science, what you really, you never want to start with data, because data is cheap. What you want to do is you want to start with a theory, and then you want to see if you can find data that conforms to the theory. And then once you've done that, you have a putative explanation for why the data set is what it is and not something else. But then what you want to do is you want to put your theory to the test and see if it's the right one. And that's why science is so successful, because it's a very rigorous method of coming at as close as possible as one can to the truth. I had a theory now, namely that repetition played a major role in in a wide variety of works of art. And so what I did was I started looking for it, and I found it. And each time I found it, I got a great kick. But of course, that's exactly what repetition does for anybody who listens to it. So I was repeating somebody's joy from listening to a piece of music that they like, except I was repeating it as a scientist. And I think that nature built that into the brain as a way of encouraging the organism to replicate itself. Because what nature's interested in is contributing to the gene pool. However diminishing this might seem, nature doesn't care about you. She cares about your genes. And to make sure that your genes are passed on and perhaps improved upon, she makes the processes that ensure that pleasurable. So you can think of nature as the carrot in front of the donkey. And that's the function of pleasure. And I think if one begins to think about this in a wider environment, what you'll find is that fundamentally, dopamine release in the brain is a way of guiding the organism to contribute to the gene pool, and artists co-opted that for their work. That's how it works.